if you're a conservative, you got criticisms of the New York Times. I saw a quote the other day from a pastor, and the quote was that sexuality is to modern culture what wealth was to the rich young ruler. If you know the story in the New Testament of the rich young ruler who wanted to know how to have eternal life, Jesus essentially told him, give up your wealth. And he couldn't do it. He couldn't do it. Sex and sexuality are the same thing in our current culture, both how you define yourself sexually, who you sleep with, all of that, those definitions, that is the same thing today. People can't give it up. And the New York Times idolizes it. You read the New York Times and you see an idea of what someone who wants to be a Western elite believes and acts out in society, and it's all tied around sexual identity. The New York Times has lots of problems. It is a guidebook, if you will, a catechism, a friend of mine said last night in an email, for a Western secular elite. And the church used to combat these things, but does not these days too often, except in small, tight-knit communities, particularly in the South. But there are still things you can learn at the New York Times. There are still things you can understand about the New York Times. And one of the things you can learn and understand about the New York Times is, surprisingly, it is hostile to the Chinese Communist Party. You have to understand the institutional history of the ownership of the New York Times to understand that while it has writers and editors and opinion pieces and editorialists and reporters who are sympathetic to communism and communists, look at what's his name, Durante or whoever, and Stalin, the institution itself is of the West, of a particular set of the West that you and I are not a part of, but of the West nonetheless. And so you actually get remarkably clear-eyed coverage of the Chinese Communist Party from many of the world reporters, many of whom have been harassed by the Chinese communists. And they have a story in the New York Times. They've put it in their business section. China is suffering a brain drain. The U.S. isn't exploiting it. China's brightest minds, including tech professionals, are immigrating, EM, not IM. They're leaving China, but many are not headed to America. China, you need to understand, had, and I use past tense deliberately, China had an innovative entrepreneurial class of citizen. That entrepreneurial, innovative class of citizen decided to invent for themselves. What's one of the things the Chinese have always been notable for? Stealing. The Chinese Communist Party steals intellectual developments. A friend of mine who is listening right now, who will go nameless to protect him, pointed out that story in the Wall Street Journal a few weeks ago that China has hypersonic missile capabilities, the United States does not, and we've fallen behind, says that is flat out BS, and he's in a position to know. And he said in a text message to me, where do you think China stole the technology from? The Chinese typically steal their technology. If you've ever watched Star Trek, The Next Generation in particular, you know who the Ferengi are. Well, you understand the Chinese Communist Party. They steal other people's technology and claim it as their own. They're not really innovators, they're thieves of intellectual property. Except, over the last couple of decades, China realized it couldn't continue reliably to grow through the theft of other people's property and the innovation of the theft. They had to invent their own. And they fostered a massive entrepreneurial class of people. The problem is economic liberalism brings political liberalism. And I don't mean that in the sense of progressives. I mean that in the sense of freedoms. Economic freedoms brings political freedoms. You grow economically, you inspire an entrepreneurial class. That entrepreneurial class wants more say in government. And in getting that say in government, government becomes more open and accessible to others. And over time, the monopoly of the Chinese Communist Party begins to break down. Where in China, you could superficially have a Chinese Communist Party, but within that Chinese Communist Party, you could have various sub-parties all underneath it. And ultimately, it brings the Chinese Communist Party to meaningless ends. And so Xi Jinping, recognizing that economic freedom brings political freedom, thinks freedom is bad and shut down the economic freedom. This is from the New York Times. They went to the best universities in China and the West. They lived middle-class lives in Beijing, Shanghai, and Shenzhen, and worked for technology companies at the center of China's tech rivalry with the United States. Now they're living and working in North America, Europe, Japan, Australia, and just about any developed country. China, from young people to entrepreneurs, are voting with their feet to escape political oppression, bleak economic prospects, and often grueling work cultures. Increasingly, the exodus includes tech professionals and other well-educated middle-class Chinese. I left China because I didn't like the social and political environment, says Qin Lingxi, 26, who worked on artificial intelligence projects at Baidu and Alibaba, two of China's biggest tech companies, before leaving in 2020. He made the decision after China abolished the term limit for the presidency, a move that allowed its top leader, Xi Jinping, to stay in power indefinitely. I will not return to China until it becomes democratic, he said, and the people can live without fear. He works for Meta in London. The purpose of this story from the New York Times is to figure out, why are these people not fleeing China? We know why they're fleeing China. Why are they not coming to the land of the free and the home of the brave? Now listen to this. In the 1980s and 90s, when China was poor, its best and brightest sought to study and work and stay in the West. Immigration, that is EM immigration, meaning outflow, not inflow. Immigration on net peaked in 1992 with more than 870,000 people leaving the country. That number fell to a low of roughly 125,000 in 2012 as China emerged from poverty to become a tech power and the world's second biggest economy. The Chinese government worked hard to keep them, rolling out incentives to lure back scientists and other skilled people. In 2018, more than 80% of Chinese who studied abroad returned home. The trend has reversed. In 2022, despite passport and travel restrictions, more than 310,000 Chinese on net left China. With 3 months to go this year, the number has reached the same level as the whole of 2022. Quite a few people I interviewed started thinking of leaving the country after China amended its constitution to turn Xi Jinping effectively into a ruler for life. The zero COVID campaign and 3 years of lockdowns was the last straw. Many people feared to talk to the Times because of government retaliation. As Xi Jinping increased rule by fear and propaganda, the social and political atmosphere grew tense and suffocating. So why not the United States? Because as much as we have made it really easy for people to illegally cross our border, we have made it really difficult to immigrate here legally. Many of these people said they would love to come to the United States, but it's simply too legally cumbersome to do. Some of them have gone to Canada to be close to the United States, others to Great Britain. Some said, well, it's too much the gun control laws of the United States. They're scared of the United States. But most of them simply wanted to go to the United States but couldn't. They wanted to come here. Mr. Zhao is a U.S.-educated software engineer who quit his job at an autonomous driving startup in Beijing and now works in Western Europe. He described his long and anxious journey to the United States. He grew up in a poor village in China's Shandong province. He went to the United States for a doctoral degree in engineering. At the beginning, he intended to return after graduation. China was on the rise. But China's response to the pandemic caused Mr. Zhao to start questioning his beliefs. But it wouldn't be easy to stay in the United States. He had a job offer, would get temporary employment status as a graduate in science and engineering, but it would only last for 3 years. He'd have to participate in the H-1B work visa lottery. There was a 40% chance he wouldn't win the lottery by the end of 3 years. Then he'd have to go back to China, and he didn't want to go back to China. We are losing out to other countries because we have so ruined the ability of smart people to come to this country and set up shop. We have a reluctance in this country to allow more people to come. When we actually need more people, we're headed towards the death spiral of a nation with our population decline. And yet we've got a lot of people who are very smart from China who do not like the communist regime there, who would like to come here, but we've made it too complicated. You want to beat China? Steal their smart people and have them work for us. Will there be some spies? Yes. Will there be some clandestine operatives who are really loyal to China? Yes, there always are. We did this with the Soviets as well. We would encourage people to migrate to the West from the Soviet Union. Some of them turned out to be spies. Most of them turned out to be people committed to ending the cause of the Soviet regime. Same with China. But they can't because we've screwed up our immigration laws. It is now easier for someone to sneak across our border than to come here legally. And that's a damning indictment on the system in Washington, the bureaucracy, and Congress itself that sees an opportunity like this to steal from China its best and brightest entrepreneurs who do not like the Chinese Communist Party and Xi Jinping, and they can't come here because we've made it too difficult. This is maddening. We should be causing a Chinese brain drain. The brain drain is already happening. The best and the brightest are fleeing the Chinese Communist Party. But we can't get our act in order. So it's easier for people to either go elsewhere or just walk across the border illegally, but then they can't get the jobs that we would want these people to have. We have got to figure this out.
He's got the courage.